Hi everyone, I'm Rob Shapiro from Fitchburg State University, and this is the BACB's 5th edition task list item G-9, use discrete trial, free operant, and naturalistic teaching arrangements. So first, let's talk about what discrete trial training, sometimes called DTT, is. This is a teaching strategy that's used frequently in applied behavior analysis, but as we know, it's not synonymous with applied behavior analysis, and it contains 4 elements. So again, just a quick word, right? It's not synonymous with ABA. However, many people who aren't familiar with ABA think that all ABA is discrete trial training. But obviously it goes far beyond that. That being said, discrete trial training is a teaching strategy that is very often used as part of an ABA approach. And again, it contains 4 elements, which includes an antecedent, which is a discriminative stimulus, the behavior of the learner, some consequence for that behavior, which is either reinforcement for correct responding or some form of error correction for incorrect responding, and then an intertrial interval, which is basically the amount of time that elapses between the end of one trial and the beginning of the next trial. And this allows for the teacher to engage in data collection and to prepare for the next trial. There's also some research to suggest that opportunity for the learner to consolidate what they've learned during that trial can be beneficial as well. So there are a couple of different kinds of discrete trial training. We can talk about mass trials as opposed to distributed trials. So in any situation where we're using discrete trial training, there are multiple learning opportunities or trials that are contained within any one learning session. And there's no magic number as far as what the right number of trials are. It tends to be a relatively low number just because it requires a decent amount of stamina and it's pretty fast-paced. That being said, 10 is a pretty common number, and that's because calculating data is pretty easy. If you've got 10 trials and you've got 8 out of 10 correct, you know you've got 80%. It's relatively easy to do that calculation. 9 also tends to be a relatively common number of trials, and this is because if you have a field of 3, the correct answer can be each of the targets an equal number of times, 3 times. Or if you're looking for even someone to select the same target in a field of 3, you can present it on the left 3 times, on the right 3 times, and in the middle 3 times. So you're guarding against some superfluous stimulus, gaining stimulus control accidentally, right? So 10 and 9 are common numbers, but again, nothing magic about those numbers. It can be almost anything, although it does tend to be a relatively low number. So in mass trials, every learning opportunity in the learning session provides the same SD and is targeting the same response. So for example, it might just be the first trial is touch A, and I've got 3 letters. I've got A, B, and C, right? And I say touch A, and the learner touches A. I provide reinforcement, brief intertrial interval. I again present the 3, maybe shuffled, and I say again, touch A. The learner touches A. I provide reinforcement. I take them back. I shuffle. I put them back. I say touch A. The learner touches B. I provide error correction. That's not A, and I either maybe I physically prompt or I provide a gesture or I provide some other kind of prompt, okay? But the bottom line is every single time I'm saying touch A, okay? That's mass trials. We're constantly providing that same SD, which creates a situation where the learner doesn't really have to discriminate what it is that you're saying. Doesn't really have to discriminate what that SD is, okay, because the response that we're looking for is always the same. However, that being said, this mass trial format can be really useful to gain some initial traction as far as correct responding. Now, as opposed to mass trials, in distributed trials, different responses are targeted and different SDs are provided. So in that same situation where I have an A, a B, and a C, my first trial might be touch A. Nice job, that is touching A. My second one might be touch B. My third one might be touch C. Okay, so now I'm targeting different responses, and so it's important that the learner is attending to the SD that's being provided and is responding conditionally based on what that SD is. Okay, so it really requires the learner to be able to key in on what that initial antecedent is that's being delivered. But it can be sometimes trickier to gain that initial traction as opposed to in mass trials. So there are a number of benefits and limitations of discrete trial training, whether we're using mass trials or distributed trials. Some benefits include that it's a structured and systematic method for skill acquisition. It's very clear what we're doing. It's presented in a very systematic way. There's clear reinforcement being provided for desired behavior and a clear protocol for how we present instruction, how we reinforce, how we prompt if we need to prompt. It's a super well laid out approach. It does allow for individualized instruction because we can determine based on the learner's needs what those targets are that we're teaching, and it provides a consistent environment and consistent stimuli for learning, which can help with that initial acquisition. That being said, there are some limitations to a discrete trial approach of teaching. First of all, that high structure doesn't really mimic natural situations, so that has to be planned for. We're not typically in the natural environment going to find situations where we're sitting in one place with specific stimuli laid out in front of us with one specific prompt being provided, right? So we have to figure out, okay, how are we going to transfer this to the natural environment? Similarly, this structured format provides little room for spontaneity. And this high level of consistency, while it can be great for learning, can impede generalization efforts unless we plan for this. So we're going to have to really think about how do we make sure that we've got a solid plan of approach for how we're going to help the learner generalize these skills into situations where it really matters. And then finally, discrete trial training is primarily beneficial for rote skills. It's not nearly as appropriate or useful for things that involve higher level problem solving. So in order to implement discrete trial training effectively, there are several things that we have to do. Number one, we have to identify our target objective. In some cases, we need to break that into steps if necessary. Then once we've identified the target objective, we have to refine that objective or the objective components so that we can clearly determine what the SD is going to be, what the desired response is that we're looking for, and what our criterion for mastery is. How fluently do we want someone to be responding and over what period of time? Next, we want to determine our method of data collection and frankly to make sure it maps onto our criterion for mastery. Okay, this is really important. If we're taking percent data, let's say for example, and let's say, and this would not be uncommon, let's say that we're taking percent data and we say that our objective, our criterion for mastery is that we want the learner to get 90% correct on 3 consecutive sessions. Okay, that's not an uncommon criterion to hear. Now let's say that what we're doing is we're presenting 9 trials per session. Well, if we do a little quick math, let's say that a learner gets 8 out of 9 correct. Okay, so they just miss 1. What's the percent that they got correct? Well, some quick math will tell you that it's 89%. So if our criterion for mastery is 90%, on 3 consecutive sessions, then we might as well make our criterion 100%, right? Because if they just get 1 wrong, they're already down to 89%. So we just want to make sure that we're really thinking about our criterion for mastery when we're determining our method of data collection, and including things like the number of trials per session. And then we want to determine what our consequence is going to be for correct responding as well as for errors. And this is really important because essentially what we're looking to do, certainly when errors occur, we're looking to prompt or redirect or run some kind of error correction. When correct responding occurs, we're looking for some response that's going to be differentially reinforcing. Right? We want something that it makes it more likely that the learner is going to engage in correct responding in the future. But sometimes we can get into situations where a learner responds correctly and we're just like, yep, nice job, and we move on to the next one. The learner responds correctly and we go, you're so silly, why'd you choose that, right? And we think what we're doing is error correction, and what we think we're doing is reinforcing correct responding, but actually, because we're more animated when the incorrect response comes, we may actually end up reinforcing incorrect responding. So it's really important that we think carefully about what our consequence is going to be, both for correct responding and for response errors. Then, when we actually go to implement discrete trial training, the next step is going to be we're going to deliver our trials. So we want to transition the individual to our teaching location, which may be a completely separate area or separate room, or it could be an area within the room, a specific desk or area that's used for that. We need to obtain attending for our learner. So obviously attending is a prerequisite skill for discrete trial training. And then we provide instruction repeating for the prescribed number of trials. And some things to keep in mind when providing instructions: to keep the instruction fast-paced. So while there is that inter-trial interval, we want to keep it relatively short. We want to move pretty quickly through these. We want to keep our sessions in general relatively short, and we want to provide reinforcement as frequently as possible. So after we've delivered our trials and a session is over, we want to review data and make changes as necessary. And this can include taking a look at once we start getting some level of mastery, are we looking to fade our prompting? Once we get a certain level of mastery, are we ready to move those learning targets into maintenance and bring in some new learning targets? What if someone's not responding correctly consistently? Maybe we need to look at that and make changes to our teaching arrangement. Maybe we need to go from a field of 3 to a field of 2, or go to some different form of prompting or reinforcement. And then we want to plan for generalization. Again, it's important to keep in mind with discrete trial training, generalization can be a real problem unless we plan for it. So we need to think about how are we going to help the learner generalize these skills across settings, across people, across instructions, and across time. So we would want a solid plan for generalization. Okay, moving away from discrete trial teaching for a minute, let's look at free operant teaching arrangements. So discrete trial training is sometimes referred to as a restricted operant arrangement because the learner has to wait for an SD to be delivered before responding, right? So I have to put out my A, B, and C and say touch A before the learner can respond. The learner can't respond before the cards are out, right? And they can't know what the correct response is until they hear my verbal behavior. So it's a restricted operant. They have to wait for a certain stimulus to be presented before they can respond. And this is contrasted with free operant teaching arrangements, where the learner can engage in the desired behavior and receive reinforcement for having done so without having to wait for the delivery of an SD. So the SD is still present, same as in a restricted operant situation. The SD is present. It can be naturally occurring or contrived, but the difference is the learner doesn't have to wait and can continue to respond. So it's not restricted, right? Because the learner doesn't have to wait for the SD to be presented and then respond. The SD is always there. And so the learner can just go ahead and respond freely. So it's a free operant teaching arrangement. So some considerations with using a free operant teaching arrangement. Well, free operant teaching may be closer to the natural environment or natural contingencies, which may aid in generalization. It's more likely in the natural environment that those SDs are going to be freely available, or at least some of them are, and it's just about the learner responding to that SD and then contacting reinforcement. So it's a little more natural, which may aid in generalization. The trade-off may be that there's less precision in the learning opportunities, right? It's not as structured and not as discrete as with discrete trial training, which may impact the efficiency of acquisition. It's also really important because the learner can respond freely, they can respond whenever they want, essentially, it's critical that we're attending to learner responding so reinforcement and or error correction can occur as necessary. Okay, whereas with discrete trial training, we basically just need to be watching when we're delivering the SD. In a free operant teaching arrangement, we need to be watching all the time. Right? Because if a correct response occurs, we have to be prepared to reinforce it. If an error occurs, we have to be prepared to run error correction to make this as efficient as possible. So it's also worth noting that free operant teaching may lend itself better to different kinds of data collection, such as rate. And as with discrete trial training and free operant teaching, data collection still has to occur, and it still has to drive our decision making. So a quick word about that with rate, right? So rate is the amount that something occurs over a unit of time, right? So let's think about why rate lends itself better to free operant teaching. Well, we talked about that with free operant teaching, the learner can respond as much as they want. They don't have to wait. They can just go ahead and respond. So the number of times they respond in a set period of time is really purely related to the learner's behavior. If we contrast that with discrete trial training, the learner has to wait to respond until the teacher presents the SD. So there's this natural restriction on what that rate can be. So rate is not just about learner behavior, it's also about teacher behavior. So that makes rate an inappropriate measure for discrete trial training, but a particularly appropriate measure for free operant teaching arrangements. And then finally, we've got naturalistic teaching arrangements. So naturalistic teaching, which is sometimes called loose teaching, occurs in various loosely controlled contexts. It highly incorporates learner preference, and it takes advantage of things that may occur naturally in the environment. So in this kind of a situation, essentially the learner is just interacting with the environment, and the teacher is taking advantage of opportunities to be able to provide reinforcement when correct responding just occurs in the natural environment, or to provide error correction when incorrect responding occurs in the natural environment. Now, just because we're talking about the natural environment, that doesn't mean that the environment can't be seeded, right? There can't be specific, we can still have specific stimuli added to the environment, specifically for the purpose of having the learner interact with them and to be reinforced for correct responding or to run error correction, right? We don't have to just say, well, that's not in the environment naturally, so I can't use it as part of naturalistic teaching. We can put stuff in the environment that basically are there to entice the learner to respond to and still have it be a naturalistic teaching arrangement. So some considerations with a naturalistic teaching arrangement. First, because it's so loosely controlled, it requires a high degree of skill and flexibility on the part of the instructor, right? We don't have those hard and fast set instructions that we have with discrete trial training, and we've got even less formality than we do with typical free operant teaching. Here it's critical that the teacher is paying close attention and is able to see what's going on and to be able to respond appropriately in a very flexible way to encourage correct responding. As with other teaching arrangements, data collection again remains critical and should form the basis of our treatment decisions. Now, with naturalistic teaching, because different contexts, discriminative stimuli, and reinforcement may be part of naturalistic teaching, it most closely resembles the natural environment, and therefore it's most likely to promote generalization. We've got a learner that's going to encounter lots of different stimuli, be responding in lots of different ways, some which may be subtle, right? And be getting lots of responding on the part of the instructor based on what their behavior is. So that's most closely going to mimic the naturally occurring environment, and so it's going to give us our best shot at generalization. However, for those same reasons, this lack of precision may impact the efficiency of acquisition for some learners, right? Because we're in a lot of ways just waiting around for the individual to interact. That may take some time. It may not happen with the learning targets that we're hoping for it to happen with. And that may make acquisition take some time. So it's important to remember that with all three of these, discrete trial training, free operant, and naturalistic teaching arrangements, they don't have to be used in isolation. It can be appropriate to use all three of these together. And depending on the circumstances, which one we use in a given situation, this may help us sort of get the best of both worlds. We may be able to maximize our acquisition through the use of discrete trial training and some free operant teaching, but then also use that free operant teaching and naturalistic teaching arrangements to really help us promote generalization.